Tony and I read a book together, not for the show, but before one of the Counterpoint series, where they were talking about the kind of the influence of kind of apologetics in ministry, and there tended to be a person on there that said it was about biblical inerrancy,
Okay.
and he was saying that. These debates really aren't happening in the world that I'm in, as far as like outside of the Chicago Statement and the American Church. As far as apologetics goes, that you dealt with, is it I have to provide answers for people who are coming out of an atheistic culture that communism promoted? Was it attempt to try and diswell the Russian Orthodox Church, or what was kind of the main points that you kind of had the most experience with answering?
So I've always thought about it in two kind of distinct categories: internal apologetics and external apologetics. External apologetics would be there. By the time I arrived, there was a massive shift away from atheism, right, towards a theistic worldview, even in the general culture, even among those that are not born again believers. Very few Ukrainians in the early 2000s would still claim to be atheists, although there were some.
Yeah, even Putin gave an interview with Oliver Stone, where he was talking about his move as a KGB officer who probably did terrible things during his time. He said this was inevitable to become a Russian Orthodox. Communism had to be filled by something. There was such a hole that it had to be something. It seems like he almost did. It may be more culturally based for him. I don't know his heart, obviously, and the issues with Russian Orthodoxy as well.
Well, and it would be the typical person there would say that they're Russian Orthodox, or now in Ukrainian Orthodox. But for most folks, that's a relatively minor part of their life, right? It's something that there's kind of major church holidays, that there's kind of obligations. There's you kind of put icons in your car and in your home. But for most people, it is not a significant part of their daily life, and so they're kind of nominally Orthodox would be probably the way to describe the vast majority. And so, I think in external apologetics, you have a few dynamics, at least where we were at in Odessa, and that is you have the remaining ideology of atheism, all right, with a certain part of the population that remains convinced, right, of the Darwinistic, materialistic, Soviet style of atheism. Then you have kind of the nominally Orthodox, right, the person for whom anything related to religion is this minor part of their life, right? It's kind of an obligation you do at certain times, but it doesn't really affect your life. And then you had the increasing influence of Islam. Odessa is right across the Black Sea from the Islamic world, and so there's an increasing. It's a kind of a market and a port city, and so there was an increasing influence of Islam in the time that we were there. And so I think those are kind of the main apologetic trajectories there for external apologetics. On internal apologetics, when the Iron Curtain fell. Everything rushed in, right? The good and the bad. And so
the Russians rushed out and the Russians rushed in.
There you go. Yeah. But all of the theological errors, everything from liberalism to the cults, all came rushing in, and this is in a context in which for 70 years, in one sense, the church was both isolated by the communists, but also in a certain way shielded from false teaching by the communists, right? Because it just, liberalism, for example, right? Who's going to go to the gulags for a liberal version of Christianity where, the resurrection didn't really take place. It's all just kind of, nice stories. Well, you're not going to go to the gulag for a nice story, right? You're only going to suffer persecution when you're convinced of the historical truth of the gospel accounts. And so I think when the Iron Curtain fell, and now there's freedom, some of the things that infect and weaken the church in the West came sweeping in. Everything from the cults very aggressively to various forms of liberalism. So that was a dynamic that the churches there are dealing with, and that we tried to help them deal with. I think right now, as we speak currently, there's a really strong push, especially in Russia, towards their version of an ecumenical movement. The Orthodox Church historically in Russia has always had a religious monopoly, and they're working very closely with the government to try to restore that religious monopoly. That's putting a lot of pressure on evangelicals and Protestants, and different churches and leaders are reacting different ways. But one trajectory that I'm quite concerned about currently is a seeming move towards an ecumenical way of responding to that pressure of trying to find compromise with the Russian Orthodox Church.
Mm-hmm. So we've read in the past Michael J. Kruger's Heresy of Orthodoxy, where him and Kostenberger responds to the Bauer Airman hypothesis, which said that what existed was first what we consider now heresy in the early church, and then through kind of might makes right, orthodoxy, quote unquote orthodoxy, came about. With it, the church being in isolation, you saw then more adherence to what we would consider strict Christian orthodoxy. You didn't really see kind of the impact of the communistic ideals or whatever else mixing into kind of what we consider Christian orthodoxy. I think that might be the kind of from isolation to where the influence is at there for Bauer.
Well, a core theological principle for us is sola scriptura, and in the communist era, the churches not only were they committed theologically to sola scriptura, but that's all they had. Mm-hmm. Was in many cases was the scripture alone. And when your theology and doctrine is derived directly from scripture, the scripture itself distinguishes between truth and error, and so the churches were very much committed to the key doctrines of the gospel, and that's because their source of authority and of their faith and practice was Scripture alone. And so it's actually kind of responding in one sense to the availability and the influx of competing ideologies that has been the struggle for them in the years since then.